shortly after the election, there were a number of people who felt some angst. And so they would come up to me and they would say, you know, what are we going to do? How do we negotiate this? And I had many of these conversations with many people. And it would seem like everywhere I go, because, you know, I go to the supermarket, I would go to the gym, even public urinals, very tender moment. Anyway, you know, I felt rather than having hundreds of one-on-one conversations, why not try to do some research, figure out the best way to address this, get some people who know as much as as possible to know in a variety of different aspects of this, and put together a program that we can really give people some guidance, put together some handouts, all that. So we did, and we had an event at the Upper Merion High School, middle school, I'm sorry. I think it was 2 nights before the inaugural. Was anyone there? A number of you were there. Okay, so I'll have to use different jokes. Okay, so it went great, and one of the things I said at the time, and I've been saying repeatedly since, is that we need to keep the momentum going. We need to keep in touch with each other. We need to keep training each other, encouraging each other, because we were troubled at the time that there were some basic things that we consider essential to what America is that were potentially under threat. We didn't really know how it would go, but we thought that there was some real potential risks. Turns out the reality's been far worse than anything I could have imagined. So I think it's more important than ever to continue to do this, because as I said at the time, and I say repeatedly, one of the biggest risks is everything becomes normalized, and we just sort of accept it. And you know, it's difficult when there's like, for a sports analogy, when the zone is being flooded the way it is, when 5 times a day you look at your phone and you're like, oh my God. That's something that is difficult to emotionally, intellectually keep up with, and especially if you're not sort of, like me, and you're constantly thinking about this stuff. I mean, if, like for example, you have a life, and you're an average person, and you're out there, you're working your job, you're doing this, it's hard to keep up with all this and to keep sort of the outrage going. And eventually, if we all become numb to this, then I think it'll just embolden those who want to keep going in terms of undermining values. I'll talk about that a little bit. I do want to say, just off the top, this is an issues-based forum. We're going to talk about issues. We're going to talk about how to protest, how to organize, how to be heard. This is not a political forum. We're not telling people to vote for or against any party or any candidate or any person. Frankly, we had Democrats and Republicans at the last forum, and I think that everyone should think this as a safe place. We're not here to proselytize or anything like that. We're here to take people who care about whatever issue they care about and give them some tools in order to enable them to do that. So I just want to touch on that. Now, another thing I want to do real quickly, even though it's slightly off topic, but I think it's important for you, is to update you, because one of the key issues that is blocking progress in America on a variety of issues is gerrymandering. So I went down to the Supreme Court to watch the Gill versus Whitford argument before the court last Monday. And I got to the court at 3:30 in the morning, because you have to get there early if you want to get in. And when I got there, there was already a line of sleeping bags around the court. So I thought, well, there's people even, nerdier than I am. In fact, I was told during Obergefell, people started lining up 3 days before the argument to get in. So, I mean, that's pretty intense. So, I got there at 3:30 in the morning, finally got in, watched the argument. Just so you know, just a little, not to get too wonky on this, but in 2004, the Supreme Court considered political gerrymandering in a case called Veith versus Jubileer from Pennsylvania, because we're really good gerrymanders. And it was a 4-4 decision at first, with the liberals and conservatives, and the deciding vote was Justice Kennedy, who wrote his own opinion saying, these lines are really bad. It's hard to believe they're constitutional, but I don't have any standard for determining whether they're constitutional or not, right? So I need a standard. Absent that, I have to uphold these lines, which he did. So the last few years have been sort of in service of finding that standard, and Wisconsin came up with a standard, and the court struck down the Wisconsin lines based on that standard. And that standard, which has to do with voter efficiency and what they call the efficiency gap, and how many votes are wasted in, 80-20, 90-10 elections, 70-30 elections. These were all, that was sort of the process. So it went before the court, and of course everyone's watching what Justice Kennedy is going to do. And if his conduct in the hearing is reflective of his views, I think there's real cause for optimism. And I don't know how much of this was covered in detail in the press. There were, by the way, there were some interesting moments, one of which is, and I've read about this even before the argument, Neil Gorsuch is just a jerk. At one point, he said, there was a great exchange. He said, he interrupted the lawyer, excuse me, I want to ask a question about this little arcane thing called the Constitution. Because none of the other justices had heard of that. And so it was really good that he pointed that out to them. And he says, why do we even have the right to look at this? Where does it say in the Constitution that the courts have the right to oversee state elections? And it was awesome because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I got to do my impersonation. And you just hear from behind the lectern, where do you think we got one man, one vote, right? There was like an audible gasp in the courtroom, and Gorsuch looked very upset, but I guess, there was that. But anyway, Justice Kennedy asked what I thought was a great question. I thought it went to the nub of what the issue is. So he said to the lawyer from Wisconsin, he said, let me ask you a question. If the state of Wisconsin, if the legislature passed a statute that said in redistricting and redrawing lines, you have to do the best we can for the Republican Party, would that be constitutional? And the woman was like, well, that's not what we have here. And he said, no, I want you to answer my question. Would that be constitutional? And she said, well, no, that wouldn't be constitutional. But and he goes, wait, then why is it constitutional to do the exact same thing for the exact same reason, just not say it? Is that the difference? And it was very good. I thought it was a very difficult question to answer. Clearly she did too. And there were some other things, I won't get into all the details, but I feel optimistic about that. There's another thing you should know about this, and we'll move off of it, which is that there is a Pennsylvania case, there's a couple, but there's a federal case in Pennsylvania saying that the lines are unconstitutional. And there was a motion last week for a stay of that case, because let's wait to see what happens with Gill versus Whitford. And that seemed like if I was a judge, I probably would have granted that motion. The judge denied it, Judge Bailson, and he said, no, this is a different theory, and he set a trial date for December 4th. And he said, I'm expediting a trial date in case I strike down these lines so we can redraw them by 2018, all right? Which is pretty intense. And it's gotten very little press coverage, but that could happen, although I don't know what happens if he does that, because A, I don't know what standard he adopts, B, unlike, in Pennsylvania, congressional redistricting is just a bill, House, Senate, Governor, right? So then, when we did it last time, the Republicans controlled everything, which is why we have a 13-5 congressional delegation, but now we have divided government. So I don't see how Governor Wolf signs a bill that's not at least 9-9 in terms of the way districts are leaning. And I think the Republicans will be reluctant to give up 4 congressional seats. So I don't know how we resolve this. I mean, we can't pass a budget, let alone something like that. So stay tuned. And I would try to, the case is Ager, plaintiff's guy named Lou Ager, who we know. I'll get the docket number if anyone's interested. But that could change everything in Pennsylvania, at least for maybe. Who knows? It's all very confusing. But I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. Now, in terms of today, there are many reasons why what you're doing is important. And part of it is, you are it in many ways. We have, in my view, and this isn't about policy differences on taxes, I mean, I have those, but these, to me, there's some basic things that we have to worry about. When we have a president who says, it is disgusting that the press can say anything they want, or that this station, does stories I don't like about me, and therefore they're fake news, and we should pull their license. Now, they don't have a license technically, but putting that aside, that is really disturbing when you have a president who talks about endorsing police brutality, and that how there are very good people marching under Nazi banners. And I mean, I can go through a whole litany. You know that litany. When that is going on, we need people to stand up, because as I've said, there is no law of God that says we have to be a democracy forever. There are many countries that were democracies and that are not anymore. Many of whom voted for people who promised to make them not a democracy anymore. Okay? It seems weird, but that happens throughout history. Not just Germany in the 30s, even modern times. In Turkey, in Venezuela, we see democracies at risk. And that could absolutely happen here. And the only way to prevent that is to, fight for this when it's threatened. And who do we count on to fight for this? We count on our elected officials, right? We count on people who we elect to stand up. They all take an oath to defend the Constitution and to stand up for what the basic, we can argue about how much money we spend on education, or what a particular environmental regulation is, or what the speed limit is. But we can't argue about whether or not we have free speech, about whether or not we are, everyone's included in America. And so we count on our elected officials to do that. Sadly, they're not, because the only way it works is if it's bipartisan. And they're not. We have a lot of people in both parties who are very aggressive about taking this on. But they're in journalism, or they're in think tanks, or they're pundits. They're not people elected because they're afraid of the voters, and they're afraid of a base, and they're afraid of this and that. So they're silent. They're dead silent, which I think is a horrible moral abdication. And I think history will not judge them kindly for that. But in the moment, it creates a real vacuum in terms of what we need to do in order to protect what we have. So that vacuum has to be filled by something if we're going to survive as a democracy. And that vacuum is filled by you. That vacuum is filled by activists. And activism has a proud history in America, and a very successful history in America. And it's not just, it's everything from Martin Luther King, and what's interesting is many of these people who were activists, when they started fighting for their cause, it seemed hopeless. And time after time, which, you almost wonder why how they got up in the morning, how they bothered. I mean, Martin Luther King was going to desegregate the South. I mean, imagine that. Cesar Chavez with the farm workers, and Roger Nash Baldwin, the hippies, bless their hearts. I'm an old hippie. My hairstyle used to be very different. But the hippies essentially ended the Vietnam War. Okay? I mean, there's a bunch of people singing, "Give Peace a Chance," and walking through the streets of New York City, eventually undermined support for the war to the point where it was no longer sustainable to fight it. That is a huge victory. And it's not always people I agree with. The Tea Party. The Tea Party did a great job in bringing attention to their issues and getting people to run, to be elected, and to be active in favor of issues I may not agree with, but clearly the issues that were valuable. So we look at all of this. Even I tried to, in my legislative career, a lot of the things I tried to take on because, while a lot of people in the legislature don't like controversy, I didn't get enough attention as a child. And so my wife, Jen, who's here as a psychologist, will tell you, I have to act out and, whatever. So, plus I have abandonment issues, plus I'm afraid of spiders. Anyway, the point is that, I've tried to introduce things that where I'm needed, right? Like if everyone's for something, there's no need for me, or it's not controversial. So, for example, when we introduced the first marriage equality bill in Pennsylvania history, it was considered a pipe dream, right? And when I introduced my medical marijuana bill, I couldn't get a co-sponsor at first. And so, introducing bills, we now have marriage equality, we now have legal medical marijuana, we introduced a bill to end the death penalty. Again, what are you thinking politically? But now we have a moratorium, and I'm on a commission that's going to recommend what we do about the death penalty, and I'm still torn about what I'm going to say. And then there is, criminal justice reform generally. Criminal justice reform is like the third rail of politics because, I've been in the legislature a long time. I've probably seen 4,000 proposals to increase the penalties for crimes. I've never seen one to reduce them on anything. And we have this like ratcheting up because people want to look tough. So we'll have, and I always use an example of grave robbing because it's my favorite crime. But if you have a year penalty for grave robbing, someone will introduce a co-sponsorship memo to make it 2 years. And I'm always like, well, do we have a grave robbing crisis in Pennsylvania, or like what is? No, but there's some guy named Bill had his grave robbed in my district, so I'm introducing Bill's law. By the way, any law named after a person almost always is a bad idea. But so we passed Bill's law. Now it's 2 years for grave robbing. 3 years later, we have Margaret's law, which is a 4-year. They increase it again because and we keep doing that as a result. We went from 5,000 to 7,000 prisoners on average for 40 years in Pennsylvania to when we started, like, let's get super tough, we went up to 55,000 state prisoners, which necessitated building 26 new prisons at a cost of about $300 million each to build and about $50 million each to run every year. We just can't sustain this anymore because our system was spitting out 2,000 new prisoners net per year every year, okay, until the end of time. And so, I introduced, and when you introduce a bill, like, maybe let's not, like, if the penalty for burglary is 10 years, maybe not make it 20, just because there's no empirical evidence that does anything to make us safer or less likely to be burgled. But then when you run for re-election, it's like, why does Daylin Leach love burglars so much, And no one wants that, right? But we've done that. We've introduced, bill to end bail, pretrial detention for failure to make bail, civil asset forfeiture, a lot of things that are going to hopefully reduce our prison population. And when I first did it, again, I get a lot of, are you crazy? My caucus saying, look, how much do you think we want to spend to get you reelected? And I say my personality is a far bigger problem than my bills, but that's a whole different issue. But, at the end of the day, we're now passing some of this stuff. We just passed the civil asset forfeiture reform bill. We have a bail reform bill that's moving, all right? So you can start on causes that seem very difficult, and you can prevail. And that's sort of our large lesson to you today. And we want to give you clearly by being here and being involved, you have the passion, you have the desire. We want to just help you, give you some more tools to do that. And we have some very good people who are going to be doing that at some of these sessions and so forth. Because all of these people, Martin Luther King, all the people who get the credit and the monuments, they all did a great job, but they all had a lot of troops, okay? No one did these things alone. And we're those troops. We're the ones who actually, on a day-to-day, get in the trenches and get all of this done. So I'm very grateful that you're here. Keep in mind, this can be hard. Activism can be hard. Sometimes, depending on what you do, you can be insulted. You certainly will be inconvenienced. In this era of social media, people will post all kinds of horrible things about you. And the other thing is, you can lose. Sometimes you can lose. Sometimes you will lose. That can be discouraging and disheartening. Most losses are not permanent, and that's what you have to keep in mind. You may lose friends. You may, whatever it is. There are a lot of things that can make this difficult. So I am really grateful that you're doing this. There is a, sometimes it's difficult to have faith in the future, I think, these days. Because you're like, my God, look at all that's happening and look how much longer we have for it to happen. And you see something happen, like, for example, the subsidy thing that was signed yesterday that's literally just going to start costing people their health care almost immediately. And as anyone who reads the scholarship knows, putting, Fox aside, when people don't have health care, they die. Many people lose their lives, okay, because you can't get the treatment you need. People say, oh, they go to the emergency room, which is the most expensive way of delivering health care, right? But you can't get oncology at the emergency room. Okay, you can't get a liver transplant in the emergency room. You can't, there's so many things, they have to stabilize you. If you're hit by a bus, they'll stabilize you, all right? But if you don't get, and plus, if you don't have insurance, you're not even going to go in the first place until it's so bad that you have no choice, which means things are much more progressed, much more difficult to treat, much more expensive to treat. There's all kinds of horrible human consequences that are going to occur. And literally, this was signed yesterday by a man who has absolutely no clue or interest in the consequences of this. And so it's hard. And that's why, I admire you for, getting out of bed, putting on your pants. I forgot one time to do that. That was really bad. And then, getting out there and fighting the fight again. But we have no choice. There is nothing else. They're undermining the institutions that are supposed to be a check on power. The judiciary, right? The free press, and other branches of government. So really, we are it. We are the last defense for America. They are counting on us. So thank you. Thank you so much for doing this.